Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. First, thank you all for joining us at this first, I hope of many, Milken Institute Middle East and North Africa Summits. It's great to have you here. I'm Curtis Chin. I had been the U.S. Ambassador to the Asian Development Bank. We're One Belt, One Road, and infrastructure in Asia, extending to Eurasia and beyond is very much a topic of discussion. It's great to be here with you, with our group of esteemed panelists. We're going to talk a little bit today about One Belt, One Road, the reality of it. We've been hearing about it for quite some time. I think maybe back to 2013 or so. I remember when Xi Jinping first talked about really over trillions really of dollars that might go into building a new Silk Road. I think 2 days ago I was with Kareem at the beautiful Abu Dhabi Louvre Museum, and the person showing us around pointed out a number of beautiful objects from what she said was the Silk Road. And so I think kind of the cycle turns again. And I think what we'll be talking about today is about how the world is changing, how China is very much revolutionizing many things. But what does One Belt, One Road mean to us in this part of the world, in the Middle East and North Africa? I've put up a slide, this came from Quartz actually, that shows the breadth of the One Belt, One Road initiative. So One Belt, One Road, where does that come from? If you look at the top of this map, really the land-based traditional Silk Road. So the Silk Road that went through the steppes of Mongolia, through Central Asia and onward into Europe. And then below that, a maritime Silk Road. So Xi Jinping has been very clear that this new Silk Road project, the One Belt, One Road initiative, will cover both ways, really reinvigorating old pathways of connections from the past. Why don't we kick it off, though, first by going to Kareem. Kareem, we've been catching up. It's been very interesting. 20 years in Beijing. And I wanted each of our panelists to begin by talking a little bit about their connections to One Belt, One Road, and share a perspective or two about where they see it is today. Kareem.
Okay. Thank you, Curtis. Well, I am an entrepreneur living in Beijing for the last 20 years. I'm half Syrian, half Russian. So married to a Chinese lady. So this is my story with Belt and Road. I mean, it's Russia, China, and the Middle East all combined. We are investing in the Belt and Road countries. And as Curtis says, I want to speak today about what's the backstory of Belt and Road, how it did come and it was initiated. And for that, we need to understand what's happening today in China. In few words, China has put 3 targets to be achieved. The first target is by year 2021, the Chinese dream will start. Chinese dream will start that when Xi Jinping has said that we will double the minimum income of all Chinese people since 2010. The second one is we will be wiping out all the poverty in China, and this will be, the target. The first phase, China has will eliminate the poverty within 3 years. Today, there is 40 million people still in poverty. By year 2035, China will be, as the Chinese saying, a modernized country. And what that will mean that the Chinese people, 1.5 billion people, will be living a life standard of an average European country. And by the way, that was supposed to happen in 2050. And by 2050, to put it simple, China will be a superpower with whatever that means in all aspects. And that target was supposed to happen by the end of this century. So in order to reach those goals, China had to find a new growth engine. They needed to adjust the social structure to meet those requirements. So therefore, they needed to have a China story, and Belt and Road comes part of the China stories. And why now? To put it also in few words, the Chinese been working hard for the last 30, 40 years on their way back, solving the issues, on their way back to come back as a superpower. We know all that in the last 2,000 years, most of this 2,000 years, China was a superpower. And the Chinese see it as this is their way coming back to their normal role in this world. So they were busy tackling that. And in the last 5 years, they had a moment thinking about it. They looked what they happening, what they achieved, and they thought that is very impressive. And they looked out of China, what's happening, and they thought, what a mess. And why it's impressive, just to put it in few words. I mean, China will be the largest economy soon, in 10 years around. China is adding every 3 years there is one UK adding to its economy, with highest, with the 4 trillion sitting in their bank accounts. It is the biggest outbound market in the world. This year, there will be 140 million Chinese tourists traveling around the world. The optimism about the future rate is the highest among the world. It is with 87%. The Chinese infrastructure is among the most advanced and sophisticated infrastructure that will meet the requirement of the future today. And I think today I was listening to Michael today about the human capital. This nation is among the most competitive nations, and the future nations of the Chinese are among the most ready future generation to meet the requirement of the future. So with all of these elements, they have, thought that this model, we can call it a China model, and therefore we will go with it, with the Belt and Road. We will claim that there is a China model and push it from here.
Thank you, Karim. That actually reinforces something that Michal was talking to me earlier about, that One Belt, One Road perhaps is also a sign of a shifting of models and geopolitics of a U.S. Dollar-centric system, that things are evolving. Michal, can you share us some of your perspectives on the One Belt, One Road initiative?
So I found out about the Silk Road through Yemen. So a couple of years ago, I was looking at the war in Yemen that was starting, the Saudi-led coalition that had entered Yemen to counter the Houthis group. And the coalition was supposed to include a lot of countries. One of them was going to be Pakistan. Now, if anybody knows about Gulf relationships to Pakistan, know that there's a very long history. Some of it is financial, some of it is ideological, some of it, we're all proud of, some of it we're not so proud of. But by and large, it's a very long history. And the Pakistanis would not join the coalition. So I thought about that and I said, odd. What do they think they're going to do? There's a lot of investments by Gulf governments in Pakistan. They must have something else going on. What is that? And so then I discovered something called CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Interesting. So at the time where the contributions of Gulf countries through aid and investment numbered in single-digit billions, CPEC at the time, I know it's been a rough ride, was estimated to be $47 billion over 30 years. I said, that's a lot of money. No wonder you'd stop looking west and you start looking east. And then I said, well, that's pretty random. Why would China just choose Pakistan? And then I was like, they didn't just choose Pakistan. CPEC is part of a larger thing called Silk Road. And I know the Silk Road. I know this word. We've heard it in cartoons growing up as an Arab, and there's this story, And then that's kind of how I got involved in it. And so my perspective on the Silk Road, or Belt Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road, the name keeps changing, is that beyond the economics and the prosperity, it is going to reshape the geopolitics and the calculations of different actors. So as somebody who resides here in this part of the world, if you look at it, you kind of see the One Belt, One Road kind of working its way through Asia. So now it's at Pakistan and it's trying to get through, and eventually it's going to get to Iran and Turkey and the Gulf. And just like it's redefined the politics in, I think, Central Asia, and you see the Chinese today, who were supposed to be apolitical people, are very much ingrained now in negotiations in Afghanistan, for example. What's going to happen when they arrive to this part of Asia, West Asia? And so if you look also at the map, you kind of see the Belt and the Road, and what they do is that they kind of dovetail out around the Arabian Peninsula. So there's stuff happening above the Gulf states and stuff happening below the Gulf states. But it's unclear how Gulf states kind of connect to that. So by and large, and I'm going to wrap up right now, I think what is really, what strikes me about One Belt, One Road is that you have somebody like President Xi Jinping, who comes at a very specific moment, very clear about China's place in the world, and very much embracing the world at a time where the US feels a little bit tired of the world. It's a little bit of a retreat, we're tired, we just want to think about our own issues, prioritize America first, whatever you may think of that policy. And so you have this plan that is very clear, and it seems to be multiple Marshall Plans put into one. I'll close with this anecdote that I heard. So a lot of countries that have industrial capacities have historically had project finance agencies. So they'll go and find, so Siemens or I don't know, Alstom will, want to do a project somewhere, and those their own project finance agencies will fund those projects. And usually the break even for these agencies is about 30, 40 years, maybe 50. And the story that I heard is that the Chinese companies are very happy to embrace projects that break even over 100 years, 120 years. No one's going to be alive to get the bonus from that deal working out. What's happening? There is a civilizational, historical sense. Chinese remind us of the century of humiliation that they had to endure, and they're coming back, and they believe that they have a place in the world. And the Silk Road is a manifestation of their ambition to have that rightful place in the world. And I think it's going to be a very, very serious and significant game changer about how everything happens in Eurasia, provided that there's no exogenous external thing that slows this down. It's probably going to be the most important development in the 21st century.
Thanks, Vishal. I was struck by that 100-year time horizon. I think I read it actually in one of your opinion pieces recently. I want to turn next to Shankar. I'm not so sure about your time horizon, but something tells me it might not be 100 years. But why don't you share with the group some of your insights and thoughts on One Belt, One Road, from your perspective with a private equity firm and your engagement in the region from Dubai or Singapore?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'd echo completely what Mishal and Karim said. This is a monumental effort on the part of China at a time when the West is actually going against globalization. And I think this is the absolute mega Marshall Plan of the new millennium. Now, I don't really care whether this is about exporting surplus capacity or it's about improving the western part of China and helping West develop, or if it is a geopolitical strategy on the part of China to influence large swaths of the global population. The reality is many parts of this world lack infrastructure, and China is backing it with finance and the capability through its state-owned and non-state-owned actors to execute on those projects. What China has done well over the last 20, 30 years is execute mega infrastructure projects funded by the state and primarily developed by the state. So this is China taking that model and going out. Let me tell you, the first time I went to China was in 1990, when I used to work at a bank. And in 1990, China had less road network than India. That's a scary thought. And just look at what China has done. And look at whether it's in the power sector or the transportation sector, any which way you look at infrastructure, China has done exceptionally well. Now, China has got another major reason why it needs to focus on this One Belt, One Road, which is a very strategic reason, which is in strategy parlance, it's called the Malacca Dilemma. Malacca refers to Malacca Straits. 80% of China's energy needs in terms of oil and 30% in terms of gas comes through the Malacca Strait. China also imports 50% of its oil needs from the Middle East and another 20 to 30% from Africa. It is very important for China strategically as a rising power not to have its trade and investment routes choked off. So at the one end, this is a very benign embrace of free trade, but at the other end, it's also a wise geostrategic, geopolitical move. There will always be issues about, can something go wrong? The reality is, under Xi Jinping, 2013, they announced the One Belt, One Road. But China's involvement in many of these markets far predates it. It started in 2000. So if we just look at, for instance, Africa, China-Africa trade was 8 billion in 2000. It was 200 billion in 2012. They didn't discover Africa or Eurasia after Xi Jinping. It was a typical Chinese approach to give a moniker to the One Belt, One Road. Some of these, and they have also backed it up with the institutions, financing particularly. You have the AIIB with 100 billion of capital, the Silk Road Fund with 40 billion, and the BRICS Bank with 100 billion. So it's building infrastructure, it's providing the incentives through funding. Now the big question is, are they building enough institutions in terms of governance to make sure that these projects, the right projects are picked, they're executed well, at the host country level, not too much of crony capitalism sinks in. And even if you build that fantastic railroad from Mombasa to Nairobi, which is absolutely welcome, who manages that railroad and how is it managed moving forward? I think those are the questions.
Thank you, Shankar. We're going to come back to some of those questions. I wanted to first, though, hear a different kind of perspective from someone from a ratings agency now. James, earlier we had talked about the variety of projects that are being called One Belt, One Road. But what really is a One Belt, One Road project? When you're looking at what are you assessing and what is China directly or indirectly financing? When you hear One Belt, One Road, what are you thinking of?
Yeah, interesting question. So obviously we're not participants in it per se. My job is to assign and maintain the credit ratings of countries. So I spend my time talking to policymakers that are on one side of this or the other, whether it's the Chinese or recipient countries. So getting their understanding and their interpretation of One Belt, One Road. And you would be surprised where this discussion comes up. It's not just in the countries that were on that map. It's countries that are not in that area that are also talking about this. How can I get a part of this? So I think the way we have to look at it when there's a project or an initiative this big, and we're talking really about trillions of dollars, right? So there are potentially very significant economic implications. When I think about it from China's perspective, I see a couple of things. One, sustaining growth, sustaining this good growth story into an even longer growth story. So they're very good at infrastructure development. I wouldn't say they're finished in China, but this opens up a whole bunch of markets for the Chinese to do what they're very good at, the exportation of that domestic development story. Another thing that it means for China is, as long as China runs current account surpluses, they're either going to be accumulating foreign exchange reserves or pushing money out of the country in terms of other kinds of investments. And I think we've been through the foreign exchange reserve accumulation period, and I think the authorities recognize that there is an advantage in having other kinds of external income-generating assets. So from that perspective, that diversification of international assets, external assets from China's perspective is good. From the recipient country's perspective, obviously countries in need of infrastructure going to the expertise that you get from China is a positive. One cautionary area, which maybe we'll come back to this during the discussion, is what it does to the external finances of the recipient countries. They are now indebted to China, and some of these numbers can be quite big. So we need to make sure that we've got a handle on that. It's going to be a trade-off for those countries always. The upside is you've got infrastructure development. The potential downside is you've got an external debt burden to subsequently manage.
Shankar, one of the things you had spoken about is the money. Where is the money coming from? When Xi Jinping first made some of his initial announcements, I went back to 2013. he mentioned this will be at least $5 trillion of investment in mega infrastructure projects throughout the region, which would extend from, he said, Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and of course Africa. It will include bridges, gas pipelines, ports, railways, power plants, really building the infrastructure of countries. Where indeed is this money coming from? I feel that it has somewhat shifted from the old days when it would simply be the main two Chinese policy banks, the China Development Bank, the Export-Import Bank of China, and the state-owned Silk Road Fund. Where are you seeing the money come from? Again, recognizing what really is a One Belt, One Road project.
Of course, the easiest way to get a project financed in China is to call it OBAR. Even if even if it's building a mall in Texas, just call it One Belt, One Road, and you will get the financing. But besides that, the reality is, besides the AIIB, the new development bank, which is the BRICS Bank, and the Silk Road Bank, which is $240 billion of capital, that of course can generate a huge amount of leverage on that capital. And then you mentioned the Chinese state-owned banks as well as the development banks. But even all of that is not sufficient to finance the infrastructure needs of this 65, 68 countries, howsoever you define it. So the needs, infrastructure financing needs are humongous. So if you take just Africa, the infrastructure needs in Africa are about $95 billion a year. They currently spend about 43. So there's a huge need. So I think, and China is doing it smartly because it now requires, which is why they have created an open architecture, that foreign companies can participate in OBAR projects, and foreign banks can also participate, whether it's multilaterals or foreign institutions, private equity, whoever. All forms of capital can and should and would need to participate to finance the totality of all the OBAR projects over a period of time. Now, the good news on that is that brings a sense of discipline to these projects. Because, and also I think China tactically doesn't want many of these projects to be branded as just Chinese projects. This is also about China coming out, as Michelle mentioned, back to its 1600 when it had 29% of the global GDP. This is about Zheng Yi, there's a sailor discovering the Silk Route in 1400. So this is a lot to do with that pride as well. So they want external actors, and the moment you have external actors coming in, it will bring a certain degree of discipline to the financing, and a lot of white elephants won't get financed, is the hope. So that's the way it's going to go, and that will be for the benefit of everybody. And public bond markets, ultimately, as the projects develop.
I saw one analyst following up on something that the Xi Jinping government had stated, was that last year, as of 2013, 50 Chinese state-owned enterprises have invested in nearly 1,700 One Belt, One Road projects. This was I think it was a Bloomberg article, who then quoted an analyst saying they were worried about the creditworthiness of some of those Chinese state-owned bank projects. Kareem, you're an investor, you're involved through your firm in One Belt, One Road project. What has your experience been as you look about, is external money coming in to these projects?
We are working on a few projects. First of all, to understand it, to conclude it, China is putting the seed money, okay? So it is, in few words. And the Belt and Road, the approach is inclusive, it's not exclusive, right? So it's open to other projects of other countries. For instance, Xi Jinping has agreed with Putin that, they will incubate Belt and Road and the Eurasia corridor, Same thing with Kazakhstan, with Mongolia, even with Saudi, with the Saudi visions. So the approach is pure economical, first of all. Second is inclusive. And China will be putting the seed money, for us to understand. Now the methods is we are going into few ways. It is, we have direct investments deals, we have BOT, we have PPP, it's different types of investments. So China is, first of all, the strategy is connectivity strategy versus US democracy strategy, China's connectivity strategy. If you want to see how they will do it, you can look at the Chinese reforms experience. So China is a pilot project of the Belt and Road, for us to understand it. First of all, create the team. Now there is a team. If you want to approach Belt and Road, you have people, you know who to talk to. Second, go create the financial tools, say AIIB, the Silk Road Fund, and others. Now this year will be coming more funds is coming. Third is go get more friends, pilot projects. So that is where we see in Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Oman, different countries. Get more friends and create a momentum. This is the key word here, When you create a momentum, a successful story, then, as we say, make the forces with you, And this is how it will go.
Absolutely. One of the, I think, great traits, even in the world of finance, is storytelling. And clearly, China has woven together an amazing, fantastic story. It was described as a new Marshall Plan for the ages. Just some of the numbers that I see, it now will involve nearly 70 nations, 4.4 billion people, and up to 40% of global GDP. So how do we better connect that? Everything sounds so amazing, so wonderful. But I know, James, you said, well, maybe there's a little bit of a cautionary tale in there. So how about another perspective on all the wonderful things that we're hearing about these projects that really will connect the world?
Well, I think, we've heard a little bit about how it's going to be a partnership, et cetera, but this is a China-centric development initiative. No one will benefit from this more than China, right? I think ultimately we have to recognize that fact, and maybe in the future that will evolve as the projects mature and countries are left with infrastructure. But the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. has an interesting database which looks at infrastructure projects underway in Eurasia, so Europe and Asia, and they've got something like 2,200 projects in this database. And of the ones that are funded by China, 89% of those projects only contract with Chinese firms. So the experience of several countries on the receiving end of Chinese development is, yes, the Chinese come, and President Bush said this at lunch today. He had an example of this. The Chinese come, they bring Chinese workers, there's a big fence built around something, and so there's not a lot of local labor involved. When the project is over, they all go home. So the immediate benefit, if you will, is not to the local economy, but to Chinese. 7 of the 10 largest construction companies in the world are Chinese. So they're well placed to do this. They're very well placed to do this. They're good at it. So we can perfectly understand that. But I think, there isn't. It's not shared from the outset. I mean, in terms of the cautionary tales part, I would offer a couple. People might not be familiar with Sri Lanka's experience, right? So Sri Lanka had a port that was funded with Chinese infrastructure development funds, a port on the south side of the island, and they were unable to repay the debt associated with that. There was very little traffic that went into that port, and so one of the consequences was that, the main consequence really was that the port kind of reverted back to China as essentially a debt forgiveness exercise. So I think countries need to be aware that they are becoming indebted to China. So that's another kind of thing to think about. I think one cautionary, I'll leave it at this, one cautionary lesson for China itself, I think, and we were talking a little bit about this before we came in, we've been mentioning this AIIB, it's the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, a new institution really designed to facilitate all of this and to take some of the pressure off the China Development Bank and China Exim Bank as well. And I think a lesson for China in terms of its external lending in recent years as they've become an external creditor is that you can get burned as an external creditor, right? They've learned this they've certainly learned it in Venezuela, but they've learned it in a number of other countries as well. If you're a bilateral creditor, if you're a multilateral creditor, you have preferred creditor status, right? So why be a bilateral creditor, when there's a problem, you're at the back of the queue like everybody else. If you're a multilateral creditor and you channel your funding through an international financial institution, then you're better positioned when things go badly. I think that might have been part of the motivation for the establishment of the AIIB. So a useful lesson from them, cautionary tale on their own previous lending practices.
Thank you. You had, sure. Just quickly, I just want to say that you had said, well, maybe China will be the first to benefit. But I think and Kareem's Chinese is better than mine. But there is a Chinese saying, to get rich, you first build a road. And I don't care who built my road, because I'm getting rich. Shankar, sorry, and then Kareem.
No, absolutely. Exactly same point. And the other side of it is that the last time I checked, Exim Bank of US only finances US capital goods and equipment. SEK of Sweden finances only Swedish equipment. So why are we blaming the Chinese for financing Chinese equipment? We are talking from both sides of the mouth. Applying to China as standard that we don't apply to any other country, number one. Number two, if you look at many of these markets, so take we talk about Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka, but also talk about the Kandy to Colombo road, or any of those roads. Nobody else built it since 1948. Or you just take in the Nairobi-Mombasa road, which is 300 miles, which has been completed a year and a half ahead of schedule. That's Kenya's biggest infrastructure project after independence. Where were the former colonial powers when Africa needed these roads? So I agree this thing about, China is doing it for China's benefit. I don't think it's charity. And charity anyway begins at home, so it begins at China. And so I think we should not be applying standards to China that we don't apply to anybody else.
Kareem, then Michelle.
Good point, James. So just we listened to President George Bush's, point about the China plans, and that kind of represent the typical, let's say, Western point of view. That it's a short-term benefits for, where China going to Africa and is bringing its own labors, and there is no benefits. They go build, take the resources, and go back home. Okay, we are in this business for a long time now, and I can tell you most of our the Chinese labor is very expensive now. Most of our projects we are using the Turkish labor, the labors from India, labors from Pakistan. We cannot afford to take labor out of China now anymore. So that is one. Second, if you look at the, it's easy to say that, the Chinese doing for their interests. Of course, Belt and Road is not a charity program. It's an infrastructure-focused initiative. Therefore, the Chinese willing to cede the money. They are taking the risk into that. And as I said, it's a connectivity strategy. And that strategy means that we want to connect China to that continent, to Africa. And meanwhile, we will connect African countries together. Where before was Africa, if you want to go from west to east, you had to go to London and then to west. Now China is connecting that world. And by connecting those countries, they believe that it's, again, the Chinese story that those countries, the people, will have a better life. Therefore, it will be the Chinese companies will have a better chance to enter those markets, with acceptable only economical, conditions. There is no political requirement there. The Chinese approach, there is no dogmatism in the approach. It's pure economy. The Chinese culture being always a secular culture, which makes it easier for the other countries' leaders to accept that approach. They are combining the well-funded SOE power with the vibrant, highly efficient Chinese private sector, and combining them. What is China reforms? It is actually a combination between SOE and the private sector. That combination, that offer, I think, the globalization phase one and the Western country are not in a position to put up the same offer.
Michelle.
So at the risk of I think there's too much the present is the future going on in the panel. And so I'll explain. There aren't really fundamental fans of free trade or critics of free trade. There are people who have account surpluses and people who have account deficits. And boy, does your position change when that changes on free trade. In the 19th century, Great Britain was the greatest fan and supporter and believer in free trade. And it was the American North that was not. In the 20th century, it was the United States that was a fan of free trade, and it was Asian companies that were not fans of free trade, and they believed in tariffs because they were trying to build industrial capacity, just like the American North. And today we find that the US feels like Japan, and it's China that feels like the US. And Xi Jinping comes to Davos last year and tells us that free trade is good. So what I want to propose is a very radical idea that there aren't real believers in free trade. There are those who believe that they will actually make a profit from free trade and those who don't. And so there was a latency in the UK. So the UK kind of peaked in 1820s, and it took a good 100 years for the UK to lose its kind of faith in free trade and kind of have its currency be dethroned. It took the United States about, 40 years from 1970s to now to kind of really have a very strong opinion and have actually a president elected on non-free trade principles, which would have been unthinkable. And so I take Karim's point, and I'm very glad he mentioned that, which is a segue, is that they can't afford Chinese workers anymore because they're a bit more expensive. So, and the speed of time changes. So how fast does it happen that even in China, that surplus gets spent because Chinese people want to live as well as people do in New York and London and other places and the Gulf. And at some point, how fast could China find itself in the position that the US did? And I wager that, a lot of, 1 billion plus people wanting to live really well, that's a lot of consumption. And it depends how fast is it that China can produce those products that are luxurious and considered middle class versus the world. And so I think there's this interesting curveball that is removed from whether China's evil or benign and China is going to build a brave new Eurasian world or not. What if China becomes so wealthy that if people start importing stuff and suddenly China's like, what if China has a trade deficit in about 30 or 40 years, and what happens to the Silk Road and things like that? So that for me is very interesting. I don't really have a view, but I do think that if it's happened to the US and it happened before that to Great Britain, which was great champions of free trade in a way that China hasn't demonstrated it is even yet, and China continues this, that's an interesting thought experiment that I continuously think about, and I'm like, just remember that there aren't real fans or critics of free trade. There are those who have surplus and those who have deficits, and we act accordingly.
I think clearly that underscores a broader point about what this panel is all about, is that where you stand on One Belt, One Road very much depends on your position. Do you think you're going to benefit from it or win from it? James, earlier we had talked about the U.S. Didn't seemingly want to support it. President Trump did send a representative to the Belt and Road Forum last year. India, I think, did not. North Korea sent one. And so, different geographies, different geopolitics. James, if you could share some of your thoughts and some of the others also on the concerns that some countries or companies might have about it, and can they be addressed? China wants this to work. What might China need to do to address some of these concerns, or just some of the concerns unaddressable from a Chinese viewpoint?
Well, I suppose the most common criticism is this maybe lack of transparency. You don't know what counts as a One Belt, One Road project. Where do you go for an indication as to what qualifies, who's making decisions? There's no secretariat. It's just a loose concept, and I suppose that's one criticism. I would think more of the concern really is the U.S. losing sort of geostrategic influence in a region. And maybe they're doing, maybe this is, we've already heard kind of the U.S. backing away and becoming sort of more focusing at home, however you want to put it, more protectionist. We all understand what we're talking about. And China is doing the opposite. And maybe that makes countries nervous, right? That's not something that looks like it's going to change anytime soon. Can China address any of these? Well, no. I mean, some of these are really U.S. issues, right? It's, highly symbolic that the U.S. is talking about building a wall with Mexico, and a lot of Latin American countries are trying to figure out ways in which they can become participants in Belt and Road. So they're reaching out to China, and they can't reach out to the U.S. So I think that tells you a lot about how the two countries are sort of approaching their international profile.
Shankar, you had earlier mentioned Pakistan. And I know with the China-Pakistan economic corridor, that perhaps has impacted India's view of some of the One Belt, One Road initiatives. Could India's concerns be addressed, or no, just these are how projects will go forward?
I mean, look, India will obviously be concerned about some of the projects that China is doing in Pakistan, as well as in Sri Lanka. And in fact, some of those projects, particularly which were approved under the previous regime of President Rajapaksa, were backrolled after the new government of Sirisena took over. So there are issues. And Japan is also not a big fan of One Belt, One Road. And India and Japan together have announced their own version of the OBOR, which is called Africa-Asia Growth Corridor. Again, a 200 billion initiative. Again, focusing on infrastructure, so you'll have many, many variants, but the winners are actually going to be, on the other hand, countries in Africa, because now we got at least multiple suitors for their, coming after them. I would just make this point about, what Michal and James just spoke about. It is not that China has become less protectionist. If you want to enter Chinese market, I don't think China is the paragon of free trade and virtue when it comes to you selling into China. It's opening more, but it's not the United States of America. So when we talk about US, being anti-free trade, what we're really talking about is US engaging more with the South, and is China engaging in quadruple times more with the emerging markets in the South. So it's really about investment and engagement. But again, there's a difference between the US and China, because in China, Xi Jinping, or whoever the leader is, can come and say, we, China, are going to invest $1 trillion there. You don't have the President of the United States, whether it's Trump or anybody else, it'll be bizarre for them to say. That's a decision in the US which is made by Apple or GE or Boeing or whoever else. So there are two different societies here we're talking about.
Kareem, did you have something to add on the role of private companies in One Belt, One Road? Or?
Talking about the challenges, I mean, the biggest challenge is it's hard, or the Chinese usually say, or they argue that don't take the Western value and judge, the Chinese approach. This is one. It's hard to judge it from even the Western-built political science, even on that. So this is why you can see now the biggest challenges, and then look who is not happy with Belt and Road is usually if I would say representative is Japan, USA, and India. Japan is the ex-competitor of China, USA is the current competitor of China, and India is the future competitor of China, right? Well, my answer will be they will have to live with it. The competitive of the Chinese approach is they have a vision. They have a stable, government. Political system is stable, is continuous. So they can put visions. Tell me other country that they know what will happen in 50 years. This is the Chinese approach, With the 2021, I see with the target that I said, they will have it. 2035, look at you can check that 2035, the target. They have a detailed approach of how many companies in the world will be leading in the AI sector, in all of every detailed, plan. On the 50s, they have a vision, right? And this is what is lacking on the other approach of the Japan or India and others. The stability of the system is different.
Thank you. People that know me know that I'm an optimist, and that Japan and the U.S. were once the worst of enemies. Who knows, China and the U.S. may be great friends again sometimes. We have about 10 minutes left. I just want to open up to at least one or two questions. You could just state who you are, where you're from, and if you want to direct to a specific panelist, please do so. And I'll be ruthless if you're going to give me a statement cleverly disguised as a question. So questions most welcome. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Tariq Sheikh. I'm president of Fleming in the region. Question around Chinese debt. And, you know, on one hand, we have this massive surplus and who's going to fund this and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we hear about deleveraging, which is a massive thing right now, right? So, you know, and you have a shadow banking system. That, you know, it's just not clear to me. You know, is it a country with a lot of surplus that is actively looking to invest internationally, or are we really deleveraging? And is there, you know, and how are those two things balanced?
Thank you. Let me take another question or two, and then we'll address them all. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
J.C. Bork from Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. So, you know, the Marshall Plan has been referenced, and the British presence in this region has been mentioned. Both of those economic systems had a geosecurity aspect to them, whether it's NATO in Europe. When, if, and how will this economic initiative be matched by a security initiative? In particular, how will that initiative play itself out in this region, which, as we've seen with attempts of the United States to manage the region, can be very difficult. And I just think of the recent Iranian nuclear deal, where the Chinese seem to be backing that, and I imagine the consternation to some of the people in this part of the region. So just comment on that. Anyone would be great.
Anyone else? All right, let's do that first question. Who would like to address the question about Chinese debt, and how does that impact or not at all investment that might be coming for One Belt, One Road? James? Or, yeah. James?
I think so. The way we think about China, don't forget it's still a closed capital account. So you can have a domestic debt situation and an external debt situation, which are completely different. There is a domestic debt sort of problem in the sense that it's very high in the state-owned enterprise sector and the corporate debt to GDP. It's high relative to GDP, and it's high in nominal terms. Corporate debt in China is around $20 trillion, more than the US and Japan combined. So there's a big debt story there. But it's financed domestically, right? It's domestic banking system, which is funded by domestic savings. Doesn't necessarily need to lead to a crisis. Ultimately, it's unsustainable in the sense that debt can't grow forever. But it doesn't need to fall off a cliff either. There's nothing that can immediately push you into a crisis with a financial structure like that. But what we're talking about here is the external sector, where because China runs continuous trade and current account surpluses, there's this accumulation of either dollars sitting in the central bank, or they invest those dollars outside in projects like this or other income-generating assets. So you can have a high debt level at home while you're still funding projects abroad, and that funding for abroad comes from the external sector itself, right? That's a sort of recycling of current account surpluses, if you think about it with a dividing line down the middle. It's never as neat and tidy as all that, but I think that's probably the best way to think about it.
Was that a don't worry answer, or was it a be worried answer?
No, I think they're two separate things. I think I think even if you were worried about the domestic debt issue, I don't think it affects your view on the external balance sheet of the country as a whole.
Anyone else want to add on that? Shankar?
James is absolutely right. So if you take the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the countries which got into trouble, Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, they got into trouble because they had high external debt. Whereas countries in Asia which had a high domestic debt didn't get into trouble. A foreigner can come and call on the debt. Domestic banks, they can work it out. Right.
Thank you.
If I may add, it's an issue being addressed in the Congress Party, and as we understand, 2018, it will, in the coming few years, it will be about the risk management. So they are working on that part.
For the second question about the Marshall Plan, ultimately economic was matched by a defense security relationship. You know, reading up actually on the old Silk Road versus the new Silk Road, I was struck by one historian noting that as the Silk Road grew, China felt it had to defend the route in which it was either exporting or importing products, including extending the Great Wall. In more recent news, we have the first Chinese military base in Djibouti, in Africa. And so perhaps that's already begun, a connection of an economic route with some security arrangements. Our panel, what are your thoughts on that question? Anyway, Karim.
Okay, it is an issue, and they will have to work on that. One of the challenges that the Chinese have, they don't have that international, managing international magnet projects. If you look at the Chinese history, historically they are more focusing, on their issues. So this is the first time that China have a kind of a global, vision and a global outbound policy. Talking about the region, the security, and this is one subject that we didn't tackle here about the Belt and Road and the region, and MENA. I do see big potential here for a few reasons. One is China and the Arab world, historically, they don't have a bad heritage. There is no religious issue, there is no political bad heritage in that. Therefore, it's easy for the nation here for the people to accept it. Second is, it is purely economic, right? So there is no slogans, there is no political slogans or talking about democracy or talking about NGOs, how many NGOs and all of that. Is pure economy. The third one, the MENA region represents a very important area for the success of Belt and Road, and historically that was the case. Therefore, the Chinese are willing to put for this area a better deal, and because a success here is vital. Fourth, it also, and one of what we are working on also, is it is a good alternative for the Arab funds and a good variety far away from the US bonds and the traditional, US European market. The returns on the infrastructure now projects are far better now, from the traditionally where the Arab funds being there. So, and also the last point is, the Chinese approach is unite and rule. It is true, because I'm sitting on the advisory few Sino-Arab platform. They don't they hated that going country by country. So this is why you see the Sino-Arab Forum Corporation, the Sino-Arab State Expo, all of that. So their approach is unite and rule, so it's a uniting power. It's not a diverse power.
On the security issue, I'd just say two things. There are two aspects to it. One is, I think China is not going to be a peacekeeper to the world. At this point of time, they're very interested in protecting their their neighborhood, which is Asia. So I see a very muscular China, it has already been quite muscular across Asia. Across the rest of the world, eventually, I think China needs to think about protecting its investments and trade routes. So it will have to be. So Djibouti is just the beginning. Let's not kid ourselves. This is not going to be a gentle power which will have no military presence to protect its interests. It simply won't happen, okay? It's only a matter of time. It's not a question of if it would happen. The second point I would make is that China, particularly when you look at the land routes of the Belt and Road, it passes through some of the most hostile terrains with some of the worst terrorist activity. So to protect your investments, you absolutely need to think about security. I mean, the Gwadar port, the Pakistan government is promising to give them 12,000 full-time military personnel to protect the Chinese workers. So a more muscular China expected. This is going to be a big bear, and it's not going to be necessarily all the time friendly.
Just talking about that, just 1 second. It's a good example. There is no country in the world will accept what have been that a foreign army will protect its own corpus. This will happen in the Pakistan, but that will be more than 10,000 local soldiers protecting the Chinese. It's difficult to see any Western country accepting that part. So the approach is different, addressing the security issues, the approach will be different.
There's no time, so very quickly, the Monroe Doctrine was supposed to be about Latin America. look where we are today. And you can't build a Silk Road without an iron fence. That's it.
I want to thank our panel and close with actually a quick 5-second question. James, you know this question already, so you already have your answer ready. So let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 is great, amazing, wonderful. 10 is really bad, terrible. If you're a country receiving BRI, a project, investment, citizen, or the government, how would you assess it? 1 great, 10 bad, somewhere in between. James?
Yeah, I was hoping we ran out of time before we got to this, to be honest. But because now it's going to sound, Fitch assigned a rating to something which we.
This is not a rating.
It's somewhere in the middle. There's upside, but I think just be careful of the downside. I wouldn't give it a 1 or a 10. It's somewhere in the middle. It's never going to be the same from one country to the next. There's too many issues at stake.
It depends on the quality of the institutions at the recipient or the host country. If you have the proper institutions to assess the risk and manage the asset moving forward, and there is less crony capitalism seizing those opportunities, it's a 1. Otherwise, it can be the famous aluminum project in Ghana, which was not done by the Chinese in the 1960s.
I agree. I mean, it's not the Chinese role to teach the other recipients how they want to do it. So it's better to learn and engage, and address your concerns. It's not perfect, definitely. So I agree. It's how we will engage and how we will be prepared for that. But it is coming.
Was it 1 to 5?
1 to 10.
1 to 10. 10 if you're going to pay it back.
1, remember, 1 is good, 10 is bad.
Oh, 1 if you're going to pay it back.
I want to thank our panelists. Clearly, this is a momentous initiative. Clearly, we will see how it plays out in whatever country and whatever your business in. It'll vary. So this conversation will certainly continue, and will most definitely continue, and it's a plug, shameless plug, as they say, do at Bloomberg, at our Milken Institute Asia Summit. So those of you who've enjoyed this, I hope you'll join us at our global conference, but also at our Asia Summit, which takes place this September 13th and 14th in Singapore. It's Formula One weekend there, and so those of you who know Formula One here in the UAE, join us also in Singapore. But thank you again, and thank you to our panelists.